Most players lose not because they got unlucky, but because they couldn't figure out what their opponent was holding. Luck plays a role, but it doesn't explain the gap between players who consistently win and those who consistently don't. It is the ability to interpret the patterns and possibilities that unfold with every hand that gives stronger players a meaningful edge. At the center of that gap is one specific skill. It's the ability to think in ranges rather than guessing at a single hand. This skill is not about memorizing hands or relying on instinct alone, but about building a framework for thinking in probabilities and possibilities, always adapting as new information emerges. The journey toward mastering hand ranges begins with a shift in perspective. Rather than focusing on pinning down a single precise hand, skilled players learn to consider the wide spectrum of hands their opponents might hold in any given situation. Every action at the table carries information. A cautious check tells you something. A bold raise tells you something different. Position shapes what hands make sense. Betting rhythms signal intent. Each player at the table brings tendencies that, once spotted, become patterns you can read. With enough experience, most players find they can start to interpret these signals more reliably, narrowing down what's likely from what's merely possible. Understanding hand ranges is more than a technical exercise. It is a way of perceiving the dynamics at play in every round of poker. It takes discipline to build a range carefully. It takes flexibility to revise that range when a new card changes what's possible. The challenge isn't just assigning a range early in the hand. It's updating that range as the hand develops. Community cards change what's possible. Pot size shifts the math. Each player's decisions reshape what you think they're holding. Through careful observation and measured analysis, subtle clues begin to emerge, offering glimpses into the minds of opponents. Getting good at this takes time. There's no single formula that works across every situation. But there is a way of thinking that sharpens over time, and that's what this series is built around. Each chapter adds another layer to that thinking, from the basics of assigning a range before the flop, all the way through to how seasoned players adjust in real time. By the end, you'll have a clearer picture of how the strongest players in the game see the table, and what it takes to see it the same way. Chapter 1. The Foundation. Understanding hand ranges. Every decision at a poker table starts with a question you can't answer directly. What does your opponent actually have? You can't see their cards. You can only watch what they do, and use that to build a picture of what's possible. That picture is what players call a hand range. It's not a single guess. It's a collection of every holding that makes sense given everything you've seen from them so far. Shifting from a single guess to a range changes how you process every piece of information that comes your way. You're no longer trying to confirm one hand. You're tracking a field of possibilities and trimming it as new evidence arrives. You see the hand as a puzzle with many moving pieces, and you try to fit those pieces together as new information arrives. This process helps you avoid the trap of making rigid reads that can fall apart when the cards turn over. The more you practice estimating ranges, the better you'll get at anticipating how opponents might play their hands. Relying on a single hand, guess tends to leave you exposed when an opponent does something you didn't anticipate. That narrow approach makes it harder to adjust and can contribute to avoidable mistakes. With range-based thinking, you're working with likelihoods rather than fixed conclusions. Because you're holding space for multiple hands at once, an unexpected play is less likely to catch you completely off guard. It's helpful to see how this way of thinking developed over time. Not long ago, most poker players focused on trying to put someone on a hand. They'd watch for small tells and try to guess the one exact holding in play. Over time, though, the best players realized that poker is a game of incomplete information and shifting probabilities. They began to group possible hands into ranges based on position, action, and style. This shift is widely considered one of the most significant turning points in how modern poker strategy developed. It pushed the game away from pure instinct and toward a more systematic way of thinking about probability. As players learned more about how starting hand selection changes by position, they started to open wider from seats like the button and play tighter from early spots. This deeper understanding of ranges led to new strategies that focused on balancing value bets and bluffs over many hands, rather than just a single hand at a time. The range perspective also helped players see the importance of narrowing down what their opponents could have as each street unfolded, not just pre-flop. These ideas became the building blocks for game-theoretic strategies that try to minimize how much an opponent can exploit you. Today, players who compete at the highest levels tend to treat hand range analysis as a foundation for their decision-making. It's not just about reading body language or making a clever guess. It's about narrowing down what makes sense for an opponent to have, given their position, their tendencies, and the way they've played the hand so far. This approach has shaped both amateur and professional play, making the game deeper and more challenging. To put this into practice, you'll want to know how to build and use hand ranges in real time. Start by considering the widest set of hands your opponent could have before any cards are dealt. As the hand progresses and more information comes in, you'll narrow that set down. For example, if someone raises from early position, you know their starting range is likely strong and tight. If they call from the button, their range gets wider and includes more speculative hands. You'll keep updating your estimate as each street brings new actions and cards. The process of elimination helps you rule out hands that no longer make sense. If an opponent plays passively on a wet board, you might remove strong hands from their range. If they show aggression, you might add more value hands or strong draws. Each action is a clue that lets you adjust your estimate. Think of it as a narrowing process. You start with a broad set of possibilities and trim it down as each new action gives you something to work with. Grouping hands into broad categories can make the process more manageable. You might think in terms of strong-made hands, hands that could improve with the right card, and hands with little real value at showdown. That framing helps you size up your own holding against the full picture of what your opponent might have. Position shapes what hands make sense to play. Betting patterns reveal how comfortable a player is with their holding. Player tendencies tell you whether someone is likely to be cautious or willing to get involved with a wide variety of hands. Stack size and the overall feel of the table can shift all of those factors at once. As you keep track of these factors, you'll get better at estimating ranges and making decisions that reflect the true complexity of the game. As you keep practicing, you'll find that thinking in ranges becomes second nature. You'll start to see each hand not as a mystery to be solved, but as a set of possibilities to be managed. This perspective will help you navigate tough spots and keep your decisions grounded in reality, not just hunches. The more you work with ranges, the more you'll trust your process, even when the cards do not fall your way. Let yourself settle into this way of thinking. It's the foundation for a deeper understanding of poker. Chapter 2: The Pre-Flop Puzzle. Assigning Initial Ranges. Every raise, call, and fold before the flop tells you something. The question is whether you're listening. You're already working with their initial hand range. Every choice someone makes before the flop offers a clue about what they might be holding. If you see a player raise, call, or fold, you can start to narrow down their possible hands right away. For example, a raise before the flop tends to signal a stronger hand, while a call often suggests something medium or speculative. A fold removes all but the weakest hands from their range. This process is more than just a guess. You know there are 1,326 distinct starting hand combinations in Texas Hold'em. Roughly 6% of those combinations are pocket pairs. Most players will not play every hand they are dealt, so each action helps you eliminate many hands from their range immediately. If someone raises, it's reasonable to expect they're holding something stronger than average for their position and style. If they just call, you can often narrow out the very strongest hands, since those tend to get raised more often. Folding, of course, means they are out of the hand entirely. Every action before the flop tells a story about intent and hand strength. Some players raise only with their strongest hands, while others raise a wider selection. Calling can mean a hand that is not quite strong enough to raise, but still worth seeing a flop. By paying attention to these patterns, you build a starting point for reading the rest of the hand. This baseline range is what you'll build on as the hand develops. It is important to remember that these initial ranges are only estimates. No one can know for sure what another player is holding. As the hand continues, you will adjust your assumptions. But having a thoughtful starting range means you are not left guessing in the dark. You are working with a framework that becomes more accurate as the hand develops. Position shapes which hands make sense to play, and that directly affects the range you assign when someone enters a pot. The earlier they act, the fewer hands they are likely to play. In early position, players must get through the entire table to win the pot, so they tend to play only strong hands. If someone raises from under the gun, you can expect a much tighter range than you would from the cutoff or button. As you move around the table, the ranges widen. Players in middle position can add a few more hands because there are fewer players left to act. By the time you reach the button, the range is often the widest. The button has the advantage of acting last on future streets, so players can profitably play a broader set of hands. The small blind and big blind have their own unique constraints, but the key idea is that position shapes which hands are reasonable to play. The number of players yet to act also matters. If you are the first to enter the pot, you risk being called or raised by many others, so your range should be tight. If several players have already folded, you can open up and include more speculative hands. This is why you will see players on the button, or in late position, raising with hands they would never play from under the gun. Understanding these tendencies lets you narrow the likely range for each player. If an early position player raises, you should expect a much stronger hand than if the same raise comes from the button. When you see a call from the blinds, you can often assume a wider but weaker range, since they are closing the action and getting a discount to see the flop. Knowing how position affects opening ranges helps you make better decisions before the flop. You can anticipate what types of hands your opponents might show up with, simply based on where they are seated and how they are entering the pot. Player tendencies shape how you interpret the same action from different people. A raise from one player carries a very different meaning than the same raise from another. You can start to categorize your opponents by watching their actions over time. Tight players will fold more often and only enter pots with strong hands. Loose players are in the mix far more often, so their range is much wider. Aggressive players are constantly putting chips in the pot, so their range can be harder to pin down. Passive players are easier to read, since they rarely make big moves without a strong hand. These styles directly affect the initial range you assign when someone enters a pot. If a tight player raises, you should expect a very strong hand. If a loose player makes the same raise, their range is much wider, and you can include more speculative hands. Table dynamics also play a role. If the table is full of aggressive players, you might see more 3-bets and wider opening ranges. If most players are passive, opening ranges might stay tight, but calls will be more frequent. You can use tracking software or your own notes to adjust your assumptions as you gather more information. If you notice the blinds are folding too often, you can open more hands from the button to take advantage. If your opponents rarely 3-bet, you can include more marginal hands in your own opening range, knowing you will not be punished often. Adapting to these conditions is something that sharpens with time and repetition. You will find that your first guess at a player's range is just the beginning. As you watch more hands and see more showdowns, you will learn to refine your estimates and respond to new patterns. Each action narrows something down. Each position tells you what hands make sense. Each player type shifts how you weight the evidence. The picture gets clearer as long as you're watching. Chapter 3: The Role of Position, Power Dynamics. The seat you occupy changes what you know before you act. That single fact ripples through every decision you make in a hand. There are 3 main categories to understand: early, middle. Each one is named for how close it sits to the dealer button, which moves clockwise after every hand. Early position means you'll act first, both before and often after the flop. This makes things tricky. You have to make choices without knowing what most of the table will do. Middle position sits between early and late, so you get to see a few players act before you, but there are still others left behind you. Late position, which includes the button and the seat just before it, lets you act last. That's where you get to watch everyone else before committing. The order of action shapes what you know and how much risk you face. In early position, you're in the dark. You don't know if someone behind you is planning to raise or call. That means you have to play cautiously, choosing only your strongest hands. If you act from middle position, you get a little more information. You've seen what early players do, but there's still a chance a late player will raise. This means you can start to include a few more hands, but you're not as free as you'd be in late position. Late position gives you the best view of the table. When you're on the button or one seat before it, you get to see almost everyone else act before you. This means you can play a wider range of hands and use the information you've gathered to your advantage. Acting last gives you flexibility. You can decide to raise, call, or fold based on what others have done. It also means you're less likely to get surprised by a big raise behind you. The main disadvantage of early position is that you're forced to act with limited information. You might enter a pot with a solid hand and then face a raise from someone in late position who holds a stronger one. This risk means you should play fewer hands and look for spots where you're more likely to have the best of it. Middle position softens this risk slightly, but you still need to be careful. In late position, you can take more chances, knowing you're less likely to run into trouble. Position doesn't just affect when you act. It also changes how you make decisions, especially when it comes to picking starting hands. If you're in early position, you'll want to open with hands that hold up well against raises and calls. You'll stick with premium hands, since you don't want to face tough decisions out of position later. In middle position, you can start to loosen up a bit. You've seen some of the table act, so you can add a few more hands that play well if the action stays light. When you're in late position, you can open up your range. On the button, you can often raise with a wide portion of your hands when the action folds around to you. This is because you'll have the best seat after the flop, turn, and river. Information is power in poker, and late position gives you more of it. You get to see who wants to play, who is folding, and how much pressure is in the pot before making your choice. Watching the action before you helps you gauge not just who is interested in the hand, but also what kind of hands they might have. If several players call in front of you, you might tighten up and play only your better hands. If everyone folds, you can take advantage by raising with a much wider range. This ability to adapt is what makes position so valuable. The more you pay attention to the flow of the hand, the more you can adjust your choices to fit the situation. Players who use their seat well tend to adjust their opening ranges and aggression based on position. In early position, they keep things tight and strong. In late position, they play more hands and look for ways to pick up pots that others might leave behind. Over time, this tends to produce more profitable decisions and can reduce costly mistakes. You'll find that the more you play from late position, the more comfortable you become using information to guide your strategy. There's another layer to how position shapes the game. The player who acts last controls the pace of the hand. In late position, you can apply pressure to opponents in early seats who know you might be raising with a wide range. This keeps them guessing and can force mistakes. Acting last also gives you more context for reading the strength of other players' hands. You can see if they're betting strong, checking or folding, and use that to decide how to proceed. Your opponents know you might be playing a wider range from late position. This awareness creates a dynamic where your raises get more respect, but also more suspicion. The key is that even when they know you're likely to be wider, you still tend to hold the advantage. You get to decide whether to build the pot, slow things down, or put pressure on weaker ranges. Early position players often have to be more cautious, since they're at a disadvantage both in information and in control. Good players use their seat to manage not just their own hand, but the whole flow of the table. When you're in late position, you can leverage your advantage to steal blinds, build pots with hands that play well in position, and keep your opponents off balance. When you're in early position, you can protect yourself by sticking to strong hands and avoiding tricky spots. This shifting power dynamic is what makes position so important. It's not just where you sit. It's how you use that seat to shape the game. The more you pay attention to your seat, the more you start to see how much of the hand is shaped before a card is even dealt. That awareness changes how you approach every decision at the table. Chapter 4: Profiling Opponents. Behavioral Clues. Every player at the table brings something with them beyond the cards they're dealt. Habits, reactions, and small signals travel to the felt the same way the chips do. Every player brings habits, reactions, and small signals to the felt. These signals can give you extra information that goes beyond the betting structure and board. You'll find them layered on top of everything else you've already been tracking. Sometimes a habit is obvious, like a nervous glance or a heavy sigh. Other times it is subtle, maybe just a quick shift in posture or a pattern in how someone bets. If you watch carefully, you might spot these tells even before you act. Over time, you will notice that some players reveal a lot with their mannerisms, while others work hard to stay unreadable. The process of using behavioral clues is not about certainty. It is about adding another layer to your range-based thinking. You are not looking for a magic sign that says, "This player has a set." Instead, you are gathering little pieces of evidence that help you move from a wide initial range to something more focused. These observations work best when you combine them with the actions you've already seen, feeding into the funnel you've been building since the hand began. Tells aren't always reliable. Players can mislead, perform, or simply behave unpredictably when they're nervous or distracted. Still, if you pay attention to detail and practice patience, you will start to see which clues show up again and again for certain people. Over time, you will become more comfortable using these signals as part of your decision-making process. Stay open to new information and let your impressions adjust as you gather more evidence. The first major category of behavioral clues is betting patterns. The way someone sizes their bets, how often they raise, and when they choose to check, can all reveal tendencies. For example, a player who tends to make small bets may lean toward value hands, though this varies widely by player. Someone who raises a lot from late position tends to be more aggressive and could be playing a wider range. A tight player in early position tends to show up with stronger hands, often near the top of the range spectrum. If you see a player who almost never defends the big blind with hands like 7-6 offsuit, you can assume their range is narrower and may lack certain combinations post-flop. Body language is another rich source of information. Posture, facial expressions, and hand movements can all give you hints about a player's confidence or uncertainty. Some players sit up straighter and become very still when they have a strong hand. Others might fidget or glance at their chips when they are unsure. A relaxed smile or a deep breath after betting can suggest calmness or even relief. These reactions are not always consistent from one player to the next, but with practice you will get better at noticing what is normal for each person and what might signal something different. Timing tells round out the main group of behavioral clues. The speed at which someone acts can sometimes say as much as the action itself. Quick bets or snap calls can sometimes suggest a player has a strong hand or is facing a straightforward decision. On the other hand, hesitation followed by a bet could suggest uncertainty or possibly a bluff attempt. Some players use timing to mislead, so it is important to notice patterns over multiple hands, rather than jumping to conclusions from a single instance. Certain player types tend to show specific kinds of tells. Aggressive players, for example, might make large bets quickly and avoid eye contact. Passive players may take longer to act and rarely push chips into the pot unless they feel strong. Erratic or loose aggressive players can be harder to pin down. Their behavior may swing between extremes, and they can show a mix of clues that do not always line up with hand strength. It is helpful to recognize these types, but always remember that no single clue is enough to make a final decision. As you get more comfortable reading tells, you'll start using these observations to adjust in real time. Say you're facing a decision after an opponent checks on the turn. If you have noticed they rarely check strong hands, you might lean toward putting them on a weaker range. On the other hand, if they have a habit of acting quickly when bluffing, a snap check could mean trouble. Each piece of information helps you refine the range you assign, making your decisions more precise. The process works best when you blend behavioral clues with the other factors you have already learned to track. Consider what position the player is in, how they have bet so far, and what types of hands are possible based on the community cards. If you've seen someone fold 7-6 offsuit pre-flop, and the board runs out 7-6-4, you can reasonably remove two pair and straight combinations from their range. This knowledge changes how you approach the hand, especially when deciding whether to bluff or value bet. Keep in mind that poker is always a game of incomplete information. You will almost never know exactly what your opponent holds until the showdown. That is why decision-making under uncertainty is such a key skill. Each action, each reaction, and each hesitation is just another clue to weigh in the balance. Sometimes you will have to act on partial information, trusting your read but staying ready to adjust if new evidence appears. The best players use behavioral clues as one tool among many. They do not rely on a single tell or habit. Instead, they let these observations add color and detail to their overall range assessments. When the information lines up, it can lead to a confident call or a timely fold. When things do not fit, The disciplined player steps back, reconsiders, and stays flexible. Settle into the rhythm of observation. Notice how each player carries a different presence to the table, and how small actions can quietly shift your sense of their range. These details don't need to be front of mind. They'll work in the background while you play. Over time, you will find that reading tells becomes another way to stay connected to the game and to the people across the table. Give yourself time to learn this skill, and let each hand teach you something new about the players, the patterns, and the subtle language of poker. Chapter 5. The Math Behind the Madness. Pot Odds and Equity. There's a moment in every hand where the numbers take over. You've got a price to call and a pot to win, and somewhere between those two figures lives your answer. The question isn't whether to trust your instincts. It's whether your instincts are backed by something real. Start by thinking about what you have to risk versus what you stand to gain. Pot odds are the tool for this job. They compare the price of a call to the size of the pot, giving you a simple way to judge if a call is worth it in the long run. If the pot holds 100 chips and your opponent bets 50, the total pot becomes 150 and it costs you 50 to call. That gives you pot odds of 3 to 1, which works out to about 33%. That means for every 50 chips you invest, you stand to win 150 if you call and win. To figure out your pot odds, just take the size of the pot before the bet, add the bet you are facing, and then divide the call amount by the new total. This gives you a percentage. That percentage is the minimum chance you need to win in order to break even if you call and see the hand all the way to the end, with no more betting. If your chance of winning is higher than that, the call tends to be profitable over time. Pot odds do more than tell you whether to call or fold. They help you think about hands in terms of ranges. When you are facing a bet, you might have a weak draw, a marginal pair, or a strong made hand. Pot odds push you to ask, which hands in my range are worth continuing with at this price? If the pot odds are generous, you can call with more hands. If they are tight, you need to be more selective. This is how pot odds shape your decision-making and help you avoid costly mistakes. Now let's turn to equity. This is about your share of the pot in the long run, your hand's chance of winning if all the cards were dealt out and everyone showed down. Equity is usually given as a percentage. If you hold a flush draw against a single opponent with top pair, your equity is often somewhere in the range of 30 to 35%, meaning you'd win roughly a third of the time if all remaining cards were dealt out. Equity is not just about your two cards. It is about how your hand stacks up against the range of hands your opponent might have. If you think your opponent is tight and only plays strong hands, your equity might be lower. If they are loose and play all sorts of hands, your equity might go up. The trick is to picture all the hands your opponent could reasonably have, based on their actions, position, and style, and then estimate how your hand performs against that set. To get a sense of your equity, start by thinking through your opponent's range. If you believe they have premium pairs roughly half the time and weaker hands the other half, your hand will do better against some parts of that range than others. Equity blends all of those situations together into a single estimate. It represents your average share of the pot across many repetitions of the same spot. The more accurately you can picture your opponent's range, the better your estimate of equity will be. Some players are easy to read, sticking to obvious hands in certain spots. Others are unpredictable, mixing in bluffs or odd holdings. Your job is to weigh these possibilities, assign rough percentages to each, and let that guide your sense of how often you expect to win. This is where pot odds and equity meet. You compare the break-even percentage from your pot odds to your estimated equity. If your equity is higher than the break-even number, calling is profitable over the long run. If it is lower, folding saves you money. Let's say you face a bet that gives you 25% pot odds. If you think your hand wins 30% of the time against your opponent's range, the math supports a call. This comparison isn't just a math exercise. It helps you refine your understanding of the hand as it unfolds. If you find yourself calling with hands that have less equity than the pot odds require, you're likely leaking chips over time. If you fold hands that have plenty of equity, you are missing out on value. Pot odds give you the baseline. Equity tells you how your hand measures up, and together they keep your decisions grounded in logic instead of guesswork. As you get comfortable with these numbers, you will notice how they change your approach. You will start to ask better questions. Does my hand have enough equity against this opponent's likely range? Are the pot odds good enough for this draw? Should I call with more hands because the price is right? Or fold because I am not getting the correct odds? These habits help you avoid emotional swings and keep your strategy consistent. Over time, you will find that this way of thinking sharpens your play. You'll likely see fewer hero calls that turn out to be hopeful guesses. Folds will start to feel disciplined rather than fearful. And you'll begin to spot spots where calling with a seemingly weak hand is actually backed by the numbers. Pot odds and equity give you a quiet confidence, a sense that your choices are rooted in something reliable. Let these ideas settle in gradually. As the chips move and the cards fall, the numbers will start to feel less like calculations and more like instincts you've built. The math doesn't demand your attention all at once. It earns its place quietly, hand by hand. Chapter 6: Adjusting to Aggression, Handling Different Play Styles. Some players throw chips into the pot with a confidence that feels almost reckless. These players rarely just call. They tend to bet and raise, putting pressure on everyone else and forcing decisions early and often. When you face this kind of aggression, the hand ranges you assign to them start to look very different from what you might expect from a more cautious player. A key idea here is that aggression changes not just the pace of the game, but also the types of hands an opponent is likely to play in a given spot. Most aggressive players do not stick with a narrow, predictable set of strong hands. Instead, they often bet or raise with both their very best hands and their weakest ones. This leads to what is called a polarized range, where the strongest value hands and pure bluffs sit at the extremes with very few medium-strength hands in between. Not all aggression leads to polarization, though. Sometimes an aggressive player mixes in a wider blend of hands. When their range includes strong hands, marginal holdings, and bluffs all at once, that is a depolarized range. You might see them betting with top pair, second pair, or even some draws alongside the occasional bluff. The aggression is still there, but it is not just about the extremes. So, when a player is aggressive, you need to pay attention to whether their bets represent only the very strongest and weakest hands, or if they are willing to put money in with a more balanced mix. If you misread a polarized range as depolarized, or mistake a depolarized range for a polarized one, your decisions can drift off course. That is why it matters to notice how aggression shifts an opponent's range from standard to something more polarized or more blended, depending on their habits. This kind of thinking helps you avoid the trap of assuming that every big bet means the same thing. The same bet size can signal a monster hand or a bluff, depending on how aggressive the player is and what their typical range looks like. Getting comfortable with these ideas lets you start adapting in real time. That adaptability is the foundation for handling aggressive play. You can spot aggressive opponents by watching how they approach each pot. One of the first things to look for is how often they bet or raise compared to the rest of the table. If someone consistently throws out raises from different positions and does not hesitate to put in a second or third bet, that is a strong sign of aggression. They might make continuation bets on the flop very frequently after raising before the flop, even on boards that do not favor their range. These bets often come in at larger than normal sizes, putting extra pressure on the players who have to act next. Another clue is how they behave when the action gets to them in late position, like on the button or the seat before it. Aggressive players tend to open the betting with a wider range of hands from these seats, not just the strongest holdings. You may notice they rarely just call. Instead, they build pots quickly, forcing others into tough spots. Table dynamics also reveal aggression in less direct ways. If one player's actions seem to dictate the pace of the table, making others fold more often or play more cautiously, that is a signal. An aggressive player does not need to show down strong hands to have an effect. The pressure comes from the frequency and size of their bets, not just from the cards they turn over. It is also important to watch how they respond when someone else fights back. A player who is deeply aggressive will tend to re-raise when challenged rather than backing down. If they fold quickly to resistance, their aggression tends to be selective rather than deep-rooted, surfacing mostly against players who do not push back. This distinction helps you separate those who are habitually aggressive from those who just make the occasional bold move. Once you have identified an aggressive player, your hand range estimates for them must become more flexible. Because these players bet and raise with a wider variety of hands, you cannot assume their actions always mean strength. Instead, you need to expand the range of hands you assign to them, including more bluffs and weaker holdings than you would for a tight player. As the hand unfolds, the process of elimination gains importance. With aggressive players, betting patterns alone are less reliable. You need to weigh the board texture and their position just as heavily as the size or timing of their bets. For example, if the board is coordinated and the aggressive player bets big, it could mean a strong hand, but it could also be a bluff or a draw. Their wider range makes it harder to rule out possibilities based on one action. Because aggressive ranges contain more bluffs, you may find yourself calling more often with marginal hands or medium strength holdings than you would against a tight opponent. Folding too often against aggression can make you an easy target, while calling too wide without enough information can get expensive. The key is to keep updating your assumptions as you gather more evidence, hand by hand. Flexibility means not locking in your first impression. After each action, ask yourself if the range you have assigned still fits the new information. If the aggressive player suddenly slows down, that could mean something has changed. If they keep firing, you might need to widen their range again. This ongoing adjustment is where you find your edge. You are not just reacting to each bet, but building a picture of how this opponent approaches the game. Over time, your observations will help you refine your estimates. Maybe you notice the aggression is consistent only when they are in late position, or only when facing certain types of players. Maybe you spot situations where their aggression drops off. Each clue lets you adjust how much you expand their range in the future. Move through these games with curiosity. Watch how pressure shapes the table, how it stretches the boundaries of what hands are possible, and how each new piece of information helps you see more clearly. Stay flexible in your thinking, letting your range estimates shift with the action. With practice, adapting to aggression becomes a calm and steady habit at the table. Chapter 7. Reading the board. Post-flop adjustments. Every hand that reaches the flop gives you a new puzzle to solve. The community cards on the table are more than just random pieces. They shape the possibilities for every player's range and set the stage for how the rest of the hand will unfold. When you look at those cards, you are really seeing a landscape, sometimes smooth and open, sometimes tangled and dangerous. This landscape is what poker players call board texture. Some boards come out dry. You will notice these when the flop brings disconnected cards, with little or no chance for straight or flush draws. Imagine 3 low cards, all of different suits, none connecting to each other. With a board like that, the number of strong draws drops way down. In fact, the chance of making a flush in Texas Hold'em is roughly 3% when measured across all 7 cards. Straights are a bit more common, coming in at around 4 to 5%. On dry boards, most players will not have many ways to improve, so the hand range for each player becomes easier to narrow. Aggressive bets on these boards often represent strong-made hands, because there just are not many draws to worry about. Other times, the board comes out wet or coordinated. This happens when you see cards that are close in rank or share suits, opening up the chance for many draws. Think about a flop with 2 suited cards and a gap that could make a straight. Now the range of possible hands gets much wider. Players could have flush draws, open-ended straight draws, or combinations of both. When the board is wet, you need to give more weight to speculative hands in your opponent's range. Caution tends to be the more sensible path, since the chances of someone connecting with the board rise as the board gets more coordinated. Learning to read board texture is the first step in making smart post-flop adjustments. When the board is dry, you can often put your opponent on a narrower range, especially if they play back at you. On wet boards, you need to consider a much broader set of hands, including draws that might become monsters by the river. Each type of board asks you to adjust your expectations, guiding your choices as the hand moves forward. As the hand progresses, each new community card reshapes the puzzle. It helps to walk through this street by street. The flop comes first. It interacts with the hands that made it to this point, often favoring those that started strong pre-flop. High cards on the flop, for example, tend to boost the range of the player who took the lead before the flop. If the board stays disconnected, you might keep your opponent on mostly high cards or strong pairs. When the flop is coordinated, though, you have to consider a wider mix of draws and speculative hands. Now the turn arrives. With 2 whole cards and 4 board cards accounted for, there are 44 unseen cards left. The turn can be a big shift point. Sometimes it brings a scare card, maybe one that completes a possible flush or straight. That single card can instantly change the balance. If it finishes a draw, you should expect your opponent's range to narrow toward hands that can handle serious pressure. If the turn looks harmless, you might still have to watch for slow-played strong hands, but the risk of new draws goes down. Finally, the river closes the action. Only 1 card remains to change the picture, and at this point ranges often become the narrowest they have been. All hand. Missed draws fall away, leaving only those hands that hit the board or had strength all along. The river card can confirm a strong-made hand in your opponent's range, or remove many weaker hands that would not continue. At this stage, your job is to weigh which hands still make sense, given all the action and the way the board developed. Each street, then, is a chance to update what you believe about your opponent's range. You start with a broad set of possibilities. As the flop, turn, and river fall, you add and subtract hands based on how those cards interact with likely holdings. When a draw completes, you might remove hands that would not chase that far. When a scare card appears, you might focus on hands that can call big bets. The process never stands still. It moves with the cards, the bets, and the shifting story of the hand. Picture a dry flop first. Imagine you are facing a dry flop. The board shows low, disconnected cards with little chance for a straight or flush draw. In this spot, the player who took the lead pre-flop often keeps a strong advantage. Their range is heavy with high cards and strong pairs, while the defender's range has fewer ways to connect. Dry boards often support continuation bets, since the board gives opponents fewer ways to connect with real strength. Now picture a coordinated flop, one with cards that link together, offering straight or flush potential. Here the defender's range grows to include more speculative hands. Players who called pre-flop with suited connectors or small pairs might suddenly find themselves with draws or even two pair. This makes it harder to push them off the pot, since their range is now filled with hands that want to continue. When the turn card lands and completes a flush, the landscape changes again. Many hands that were chasing that draw now have a made flush. If a player keeps betting strongly, you need to respect that their range has shifted toward hands that can stand up to heat. Weak hands likely fall away, and only those with real strength remain. The same logic applies when a turn card does not complete any draws. Now the range might actually expand, since more hands can continue without fear. On the river, the final card often brings the story to a close. If a big bet arrives and the board looks dangerous, you can narrow your opponent's range to hands that beat missed draws or that have found strong-made hands. A check raise on the river can signal that only a narrow set of holdings makes sense. When the river is a blank and draws miss, you can widen your assumptions and expect more bluffs and weaker hands to appear. Throughout all these situations, the key is to keep updating your picture of what hands are possible. Each new card, each bet, each pause gives you more information. The process never stops until the last chip is pushed. This habit of dynamic, street-by-street range assessment is what separates careful players from those who just guess and hope. Take your time as you watch the board develop. Let yourself notice how each card changes the story. With practice, you will find that reading the board becomes a quiet, steady rhythm beneath your decisions. With time, these reads will start to shape how you play each street, not just how you interpret it. Let the feeling of possibility linger as you wait for the next hand to begin. Chapter 8: The Bluff Factor. Distinguishing real from fake. Every hand you play is shadowed by a question you can't always answer. Is the person betting across from you doing it because they have something, or because they want you to think they do? When someone bets or raises without a strong hand, they are using a bluff to change how others see their range. They want you to believe they hold a powerful hand, even when their cards are weak or have missed completely. This act of misdirection adds a layer of uncertainty to every decision you face at the table. Players use bluffs to force folds from hands that could beat them at showdown. By mimicking the same betting patterns they would use with real strength, they stretch the boundaries of what you can trust. In no-limit Texas Hold'em, this might mean betting big on the river with nothing but a missed draw, hoping to represent a full house or flush. When these moves succeed, it is not just about winning the pot. It is about shaping your perception of their hand range going forward. This manipulation works because poker is a game played in the shadows of incomplete information. When someone bluffs, they inject doubt into your process of narrowing their range. You are no longer sure if a large bet means strength or simply a well-timed move with air. That uncertainty makes every decision heavier. It creates pressure, forcing you to question your reads and your instincts. Bluffing also keeps a player's strategy balanced. If they only bet big with strong hands, opponents would quickly adjust and fold all but their best holdings. By mixing in bluffs, A player protects themselves from being too predictable. In no-limit Texas Hold'em, river overbets often signal a polarized range, where the bettor is representing either a very strong hand or a complete bluff with little in between. This makes it harder for you to find a clear answer. Sometimes a player will choose to bluff with cards that block the strongest possible hands you might hold. For example, if the board shows an ace, holding an ace themselves means you are less likely to have top pair. Those cards reduce the number of strong hands you can realistically hold, and that shift in probabilities can make the bluff harder to see through. Recognizing bluffs starts with watching for betting patterns that do not fit the story. When someone makes a move that does not match their previous tendencies, your attention should sharpen. For example, if a player who usually bets small suddenly overbets the river, that could signal a bluff trying to push you off a decent hand. It is not always a guarantee, but it is a clue worth noting. Player tendencies play a big part. Some players are naturally aggressive and will fire multiple barrels with weak holdings. Others are careful and rarely risk chips without real value. When you see an opponent make frequent aggressive plays, you can start to estimate that their bluffing frequency is higher than average. This does not mean every big bet is a bluff, but patterns matter over time. Situational context is just as important. The stage of the hand, the number of players in the pot, and the board texture all shape bluffing opportunities. Dry boards with few draws can create conditions where bluffing becomes more appealing, particularly when a player thinks your range is weighted toward unpaired high cards. On coordinated boards with many draws, bets might be more likely to represent real strength, but they can also be desperate attempts to steal a pot before a scare card arrives. Position cannot be ignored. Players who act last have the most information and often use that advantage to apply pressure with bluffs. If someone in late position bets big after the action checks to them, the chance of a bluff goes up, especially if the board favors their perceived range. Early position bets tend to carry more perceived credibility, because the player acting first faces the risk of facing a raise or re-raise from anyone behind them. Previous actions help complete the picture. If a player folded to a 3-bet before, you can eliminate some strong hands from their range. If they call from the blinds and the flop misses their usual holdings, their post-flop bets may be more likely to be bluffs or semi-bluffs. Paying close attention to these details lets you build a profile of how often and in which spots a player is likely to bluff. When you start to spot likely bluffs, your strategy should shift in response. The first step is to adjust how you assess your opponent's hand range. If you suspect they are bluffing, you can assign more weight to weaker hands or missed draws when making your decision. This does not mean you should always call, but it does mean you can be less afraid of monsters under the bed. If you notice an opponent is bluffing too often, you can widen your calling or raising ranges in spots where their story does not add up. For example, if they make small bets on boards where their range is weak, you can respond with value bets or timely calls using hands that beat their likely bluffs. When their range appears capped and is unlikely to contain the strongest hands, that can create opportunities to apply pressure with a well-timed raise. Staying flexible is key. Reads can change from hand to hand, and a single action does not always reveal the full truth. Avoid locking yourself into one interpretation. Instead, keep updating your understanding as new evidence comes in. You want to exploit opponents who bluff too much, but you also want to avoid becoming predictable yourself. Bluff-to-value ratios shift as the hand progresses. Earlier streets tend to carry more bluffs relative to value hands. By the river, that balance tips toward value, with bluffs becoming less frequent. Watching how your opponents balance their own ranges can help you make sharper adjustments. When you spot a clear pattern in how someone plays, you can lean into it. A player who folds too often to pressure gives you room to bluff more. A player who calls too much becomes a target for thinner value bets. The goal is to turn their habits into your advantage, one decision at a time. Give yourself permission to sit with the uncertainty. The signals are there. They'll come into focus as you keep watching. Each bluff, each call, and each fold adds a new layer to the ongoing conversation between players. As you learn to spot the signals and trust your evolving reads, you will find yourself more comfortable with uncertainty, more ready to respond, and more aware of the subtle games within the game. Give yourself space to observe, adapt, and let the patterns reveal themselves in their own time. Chapter 9: The Role of Stack Sizes, Strategic Implications. The chips in front of you are not decorative. Some stacks are tall and heavy. Others are small and tight. That difference quietly controls what each player at the table can and cannot do. That stack of chips in front of you is more than just a pile of clay. It represents your ammunition, your shield, and the boundaries of every decision you make. In No Limit Texas Hold'em, stack size means the number of big blinds you have available to play. This number quietly shapes every hand you choose, every risk you weigh, and every story you tell at the table. If your stack is deep, maybe 100 big blinds or more, you have the freedom to explore. With this depth, you can open up your hand range before the flop. You are able to add suited connectors, small pairs, and other speculative holdings because there is room to maneuver after the flop. There is time to build a pot when you hit, and there is space to back away if the board turns dangerous. The game feels open, with more possibilities on each street. When your stack is shallow, 20 big blinds, maybe even less, the game tightens. There is not much room for creative play. The hands you choose to play must be strong right away. Marginal holdings lose their value because there is little chance to bluff or chase draws over several streets. You are forced to focus on immediate value and straightforward decisions. Many cash games set their minimum buy-in between 20 and 40 big blinds, so you will often see players in this range. Their actions tend to be more direct, with fewer surprises. Many standard cash games cap the maximum buy-in at 100 big blinds, though some games allow 200 or more. Players near this cap have the most flexibility. They can apply pressure, defend, and adjust their ranges based on the situation. When you watch a table, notice how the tallest stacks tend to drive the action, while shorter stacks play more cautiously. Understanding these patterns gives you an edge before any cards are dealt. Stack size does more than shape hand ranges. It sets the boundaries for every decision you face, whether you are folding, calling, or raising, before the flop and after it. With a short stack, your choices narrow. If you pick up a premium hand, you might be looking for the first chance to move all in. Slow playing or calling with a weak holding tends to offer very little value in most short stack situations. The risk to reward balance often leans toward committing chips pre-flop when holding strong hands, since waiting for a better spot may cost you fold equity you cannot recover. Players with fewer than 20 big blinds will often look for spots to commit their stack before the flop, particularly when they pick up a strong hand. When you have a deep stack, your options open up. You can raise 2 or 3 big blinds before the flop, and still have plenty of chips behind to play out the hand. After the flop, you might call with a drawing hand, knowing you can win a big pot if you hit. Deep stacks let you apply pressure over several streets, sizing your bets to build a pot or force folds. You can bluff more convincingly, or trap with strong hands, because you have enough chips to tell a believable story. Medium stacks, somewhere between 20 and 100 big blinds, create a middle ground. Players here must balance aggression and caution. They often adjust their pre-flop raising sizes to maximize fold equity, especially when facing shorter stacks. Against deeper stacks, they might play more conservatively, avoiding spots where they risk their entire stack without a strong hand. The pressure of stack size is always present, shaping how each player approaches the hand. These dynamics do not exist in isolation. Stack size interacts with table position, and that combination shapes the incentives and risks of every hand. Imagine a player in early position with a short stack. They know that acting first means less information, so their range tightens even further. Only the strongest hands are worth opening, because there is little room for error if someone behind them wakes up with a big hand. A tight player in this spot will rarely surprise you with a weak holding. Now look at late position, especially on the button. A deep stack here is a powerful tool. The player can open a much wider range, including suited connectors and weaker aces, because they act last on every street. They can control the pot size and respond to others' actions with more information. Even with a short stack, the button can widen their shoving range, taking advantage of fold equity against blinds and shorter stacks. This is why button shoves are so common in short stack cash games. The combination of stack size and position also affects how credible a player's aggression appears. A big raise from early position with a short stack tends to represent a strong range, which makes a bluff unlikely in most cases. The risk is simply too high, so the range is tight. In contrast, a late position raise from a deep stack could be almost anything, from a disguised monster to a speculative draw. This interplay helps you filter out unlikely holdings and refine your read on an opponent's range. As the stacks shift from hand to hand, let yourself notice how the strategies shift with them. Some players tighten up when their stacks shrink, while others become bolder out of necessity. Deep stacks might start wide, then narrow as the action heats up. Each stack tells a story about what is possible and what is likely. Let the stacks register quietly as each hand begins. They shape the rhythm of the action and the weight behind every move. The more you tune into these silent signals, the easier it becomes to sense which hands are truly in play and which are just passing through. As the chips move around the table, let your understanding of stack sizes become a quiet, guiding presence behind every decision you make. Chapter 10: The Metagame, Adapting to Table Dynamics. Some games have a surface rhythm you can see in every hand: bets, calls, raises, and folds. Beneath that, though, there is a quieter conversation happening. This layer isn't about any single hand or round. It's about the way players respond to each other over time, adjusting to patterns and moods that shift as the session unfolds. That's where the metagame lives. You're not responding to one hand in isolation. You're responding to the whole table, tracking how players shift their approach as the session moves forward and the atmosphere changes around them. The metagame asks you to notice when things start to feel different. Maybe the table has tightened up after a big pot, or maybe a few players are suddenly playing many more hands than before. These changes matter. They guide you in reshaping your own hand range decisions to fit the current flow, rather than sticking to a fixed plan. When you are tuned into the metagame, you will start to see that decisions are rarely isolated. If a player has just lost a large pot, they might play more cautiously for a while. If someone has been caught bluffing, the next time they bet big, opponents might be more likely to call. These are not rules but tendencies that emerge from the group. The better you get at noticing these shifts, the more you can anticipate which strategies will work right now, not just in theory, but at this particular table, with these particular players. The most skilled players treat the metagame as a living map. They adjust their own starting hands and bet sizing to match the current environment. If the table has tightened and players are folding more often, opening your range and bluffing more frequently tends to be a reasonable response. If the table gets looser and people are calling with a wide range, you may find it better to value bet more and cut back on bluffs. This process, known as exploitative play, is not about finding a perfect strategy for all situations. It is about finding the best response to what is happening right now. You will find that the metagame does not stand still. It is always moving, shaped by every action, every reaction, and every shift in mood. Staying aware of this deeper current lets you adapt before your opponents do. Over time, this habit of reading and responding to the table as a whole will become one of your strongest advantages. You'll carry your reads about each player into this layer of the game. Someone who plays tight from early position and someone who plays loose from late position will show up differently in your range assignments. An aggressive player's 3-bets will carry a different weight than the same action from a passive one. Each adjustment helps you narrow down what hands are truly in play. At the same time, your own table image is always being built. Every time you show down a strong hand or get caught bluffing, the table is watching. Over time, this reputation starts to color how others respond to your bets. If you have played very few hands and shown down strong cards, you may be seen as tight. That image can make your bluffs more credible, since opponents are more likely to give you credit for a strong hand. On the other hand, if you have been caught bluffing or called down light, you might need to tighten up for a while, focusing on value bets that get paid off by curious opponents. History matters. If you have a long session with the same group, each interaction becomes a thread in the story. Maybe you made a big call against one player early on, and they have been more cautious around you since. Or you remember a hand where an opponent slow played a strong hand, and you watch for signs they might do it again. These details help you make better decisions in the moment, but they also remind you to stay flexible. No single hand tells the whole story. You need to keep updating your reads as new information comes in. Sometimes you'll hold on to an idea about a player longer than the evidence supports. You might carry a read of someone as very tight, and then watch them make a loose call or a well-timed bluff. Adaptability is essential here. As soon as you notice a change, let yourself adjust your expectations. Revisit the way you assign ranges, and be willing to try a new approach. The more quickly you can update your view of the table, the less likely you are to be caught off guard. To get better at reading the metagame, you will need to sharpen your powers of observation. Start by paying close attention to how each player enters pots, how often they fold, and how they size their bets. In live games, you can also watch for physical tells or timing tells, small clues in the way someone moves or the speed with which they act. These details may not always be reliable, but over time, you will start to notice patterns. Pattern recognition is something you can develop deliberately. After each session, take a moment to think about which players were most active, who was willing to call down light, and who tended to avoid confrontation. If you play online, make use of the tracking tools and note-taking features. Review hand histories to see which types of hands opponents are willing to play, and look for recurring behaviors. Does someone always check-raise big with strong hands? Do they fold suited connectors early, but play them late? Each pattern you spot helps you narrow their range and respond more accurately. Consistent practice is the key to making these skills second nature. In live games, let yourself settle into a steady rhythm of observation. In online games, use the software to track statistics and review hands between sessions. The more you practice, the more you will find that you can spot changes at the table quickly and adjust your strategy in real time. As you watch the game evolve, let yourself notice the subtle shifts in energy and approach. Let each session teach you something new about how players, patterns, and moods interact. The metagame rewards patience and attention. The more you see, the more you can adapt, quietly shaping your strategy to fit the table as it is right now. Let this awareness grow in the background as you play, becoming a gentle guide through the many layers of the game. Chapter 11. The Art of Folding. Knowing when to let go. There's a moment at the table that most players rush past without thinking. You've seen the bets, read the action, and somewhere in that sequence, it becomes clear your hand isn't good enough. What you do next matters more than most players realize. It is not a retreat. It is a calculated action that keeps you in control of your stack and your future opportunities. In cash games, every chip you do not lose is a chip you can use when the odds are finally in your favor. Letting go of hands that sit on the edge of profitability is how you avoid the slow leak that can drain a bankroll over hours or even days. Choosing to fold is not just about waiting for better cards. It is about knowing when your current hand, given the action and the likely ranges involved, is no longer worth the risk. If you hold a weak pair, for example, your chances of improving to 2-pair or better by the river are fairly slim, often somewhere in the range of roughly 17 to 20%, depending on how many cards can help you and what's already showing. That slim chance rarely justifies chasing against strong betting from an opponent whose range is already weighted toward hands that dominate you. When you fold in these spots, you are not giving up. You are actively protecting yourself from situations where you are more likely to lose than win. The discipline to let go frees up your resources for the hands where your equity is higher. Over many sessions, those disciplined folds add up, reducing the swings in your results and keeping unnecessary losses to a minimum. Avoiding marginal confrontations lets you wait for spots where your range matches up well against what your opponents are likely to hold. Over time, these are the moments that build a healthy, resilient bankroll. Letting go of a hand is also a mark of strategic maturity. It shows you are thinking about the long game, not just the outcome of one pot. Poker rewards those who can step back from short-term pride and focus on making the best decision for their overall success. Each time you fold a hand that looks tempting but does not fit the situation, you are making a choice that keeps you in the game and ready for the next opportunity. To know when to fold, you need to pay close attention to your opponents. Their actions, especially before the flop, can tell you a lot about the strength of their range. When someone raises from early position, they're often holding a tighter selection of strong hands. Against many players, that range tends to include hands like pocket aces, pocket kings, pocket queens, ace-king suited, or ace-queen. If your hand doesn't compete well with that kind of range, folding tends to be the stronger choice. As the hand progresses, each bet and each call helps narrow down what your opponent might be holding. If an opponent continues to show aggression on later streets, especially with larger bets, their range often shifts toward the strongest value hands and fewer bluffs. When you see a small bet from an opponent on a coordinated board, it can sometimes indicate they're protecting a made hand they don't want to give free cards to. That said, small bets on coordinated boards can also represent a range bet or a blocker bet, so the read depends heavily on that player's tendencies. In these moments, holding on to a middle-strength hand can become a trap. Folding protects you from running into their value-heavy range. Bet sizing, timing, and frequency all add layers to your read. A quick bet can sometimes suggest confidence in a strong hand, while hesitation might indicate uncertainty. Neither signal is reliable on its own, but patterns across multiple hands start to paint a picture. Over time, you will notice patterns in how your opponents play their strong hands versus their bluffs. If you notice a player folding speculative hands from early position, you can begin ruling out that part of their range as the hand develops. This process of elimination helps you make more confident folds when the pressure is on. Your folding decisions should always adjust as you gather new information. What looked like a close call on the flop may become an easy fold by the turn if your opponent doubles down with a large bet. When facing a big turn bet with a marginal hand, it's worth remembering that opponents who bet large on the turn tend to be weighted toward value hands more often than not. The exact frequency varies by player type, but calling into that range is generally more hopeful than profitable. That means calling in these spots is often more hopeful than profitable. The skill of folding well comes from practice and from watching carefully for the signals your opponents give off, both in their betting and in their behavior. Of course, knowing when to fold is not just about the cards and the math. There is a real psychological challenge in letting go. Sometimes it feels like you are missing out on a big pot, or that you are letting another player push you around. Ego can make you want to prove you were right, or that you cannot be bluffed. The fear of missing out can tempt you to chase hands that do not deserve your chips. To build the discipline to fold, you need to set aside these emotional traps. Remind yourself that folding is not an admission of weakness. It is a sign that you are thinking clearly and acting with purpose. Setting clear criteria for folding before the hand even begins can help. Review your decisions objectively after the session, without regret or self-judgment. Over time, this approach helps you build mental resilience and reduces the sting of folding tough hands. Practicing these habits over many sessions will help you handle the emotional ups and downs that come with poker. When you consistently make wise folds, you reinforce your long-term profitability and protect yourself from the tilt that can follow a painful loss. Each disciplined fold is a quiet victory, one that moves you closer to the level of strategic maturity that separates the best players from the rest. The chips you protect today stay available for the spots where your edge is clear. That's the quiet logic behind every disciplined fold. It doesn't announce itself, and it doesn't need to. Chapter 12. Exploiting Weakness. Identifying leaks in ranges. The habits form quietly. A player raises a little too wide from early position. Another calls when they should fold. These patterns don't announce themselves, but they cost chips every time they repeat. These repeating mistakes are called leaks, and they quietly drain your expected value across many hands without announcing themselves. These flaws aren't always obvious. They quietly drain your expected value across many hands, often without you noticing until the results start to reflect it. Leaks often show up in the way players build their hand ranges. For example, someone might consistently play suited connectors from early position, even when those hands lose value in that seat. Over hundreds or thousands of hands, this single habit can quietly erode their winnings in ways that compound across a long session. That adds up quickly, especially in no-limit Texas Hold'em, where the swings can be large. Sometimes leaks come from overvaluing certain hands. Some players cannot resist the urge to raise or call with hands that are simply too weak for the situation. This might look like calling every raise with any suited ace, or getting involved with weak pairs against strong action. These tendencies show up as megalomania and calling station behavior, patterns that have already cost many players far more than they realize. Other leaks are rooted in predictability. If a player always bets strong hands the same way, or only bluffs on obvious boards, their range becomes capped, meaning opponents can rule out the strongest hands from their holdings on certain boards. For example, if someone rarely slow plays a set and tends to raise it consistently, then when they just call, you can often remove sets from their range. Over time, these predictable betting patterns make it easier for opponents to read and counter their strategy. Focusing too much on specific hands rather than thinking in ranges can also be a leak. If a player tries to guess exactly which cards you hold instead of considering all the likely hands in your range, they often make poor decisions. This single-minded approach leads to missed opportunities and costly mistakes, especially when the board and betting tell a more complex story. Leaks are not always glaring errors. They can be subtle, woven into the fabric of a player's decisions. Even experienced players carry small leaks that go unnoticed until an observant opponent begins to take advantage. Recognizing the general shape of these weaknesses is the first step toward turning them into opportunities. Spotting leaks in real time means watching how your opponents behave over many hands. You don't need software or detailed stats at this stage. Start by paying close attention to how often a player raises, what hands they show down, and the patterns in their betting. When someone raises from early position, you can usually assume their range is tighter, especially if they are a known tight player. If a loose player keeps entering pots with a wide range of hands, you will see more weak holdings at Showdown. One reliable method is to watch for repeated actions. If you notice someone always calls but rarely raises, or always bets strong hands and checks weak ones, you are seeing the outline of their range leaks. These patterns show up over time, not in a single hand. The more hands you observe, the clearer the picture becomes. Showdown outcomes offer valuable clues. If a player wins at Showdown much more often than they lose, it can suggest they are only betting with very strong hands. If another player rarely fires a continuation bet on ace-high flops, it suggests they give up too easily, making them vulnerable to aggression. Position matters too. When you see a tight player raise from early position, you can reasonably eliminate many weak hands from their range. On the other hand, if a player in late position raises frequently, you know their range is likely wider. As the hand progresses, use the process of elimination to narrow down the possibilities based on their actions and the board texture. Keeping track of these observations can be as simple as making mental notes or writing down patterns after a session. Over time, you'll start to recognize which players are likely to repeat the same mistakes. That recognition becomes a roadmap for future hands. Once you have identified a leak in an opponent's range, the next step is to adjust your strategy to exploit it. If you notice someone consistently caps their range by never slow playing strong hands, you can bluff more often on boards where they are unlikely to hold the nuts. By attacking these capped ranges, you can apply pressure and force folds from hands that cannot stand up to aggression. When you face players who fold too often on the river, you can value bet thinner, knowing they will let go of marginal hands. This allows you to extract extra chips from situations where a more balanced opponent might call you down. The key is to adjust your own hand range so that you are targeting their specific weaknesses without exposing yourself to unnecessary risk. Targeting passive players with low preflop raising tendencies is another way to exploit range leaks. These players often cap their ranges by calling too much and raising too little. You can use measured aggression to take pots away from them, but be careful not to overdo it. If you become too aggressive, even passive players may adjust and start calling you down lighter or trapping with strong hands. Plugging your own leaks is just as important. If you find yourself consistently losing in certain spots, such as calling with hands that have negative expected value over time, start folding those hands and watch your results improve. As you become more aware of your opponent's leaks, you will also become more disciplined about avoiding similar mistakes in your own game. Combining your opponent's tendencies into a rough profile helps you fine-tune your strategy. If you notice a player limps often but rarely raises, you can isolate them with a wider range and play more pots in position. It's worth comparing the expected value of folding, calling, or raising before making a move against a known leak. Sometimes the best exploitation is simply letting go of a marginal hand and waiting for a better spot. As you grow more comfortable identifying and exploiting leaks, remember that poker is a game of adjustments. Your edge comes from staying one step ahead, adapting as your opponents change their approach. Some leaks will close over time as players improve, while new ones will appear as habits shift. Let your awareness guide you, and trust that the small details you notice today will become the foundation for deeper strategies ahead. The patterns are already there. You just have to slow down long enough to see them. Each one you notice is a small edge waiting to be put to use. Chapter 13. Balancing your range. Avoiding predictability. Your habits at the table tell a story. Sharp opponents are always reading that story, and if it follows the same pattern every time, they already know how it ends. If you tend to take the same actions with the same types of hands, sharp opponents will likely start to see the pattern. Over time, they will use these patterns to narrow down what you could be holding in each situation. When you tend to play only your strongest hands aggressively, others will often fold their weaker holdings as soon as you show strength. They will wait for a better spot, leaving you with only small pots and little reward for your patience. If you lean too far the other way and play mostly weak hands hoping to catch opponents off guard, you'll likely find yourself losing chips over time. Weak hands tend to have poor equity against the ranges most opponents play, and they don't hold up at showdown as often as stronger holdings do. That predictability is the opening your opponents are looking for. Once they can anticipate your actions, they can start adjusting to take advantage of them. They will start to fold more often against your obvious strength. They will call you down more lightly when you show signs of weakness. Your profits shrink as your strategy drifts from optimal play. Over many sessions, small patterns in your betting or hand selection can start to become visible to observant opponents, and the more consistent those patterns are, the easier they become to exploit. That is why balancing your range is not just a fancy concept. It is a key defensive move that keeps you from being read too easily. When you mix up your actions, you protect yourself from becoming a target for skilled opponents. The consequences of unbalanced play are not usually dramatic in a single hand. Instead, they appear over time as your opponents quietly adjust. You might notice that your bluffs stop working, or your value bets get less action. It feels like the table has caught on, and in many ways it has. The benefit of a diverse range is that you restore uncertainty to your game. You keep others guessing, which is essential for long-term success. If nobody can say for sure what you are holding, your decisions become harder to counter. That consistency is what separates players who fade over time from those who stay competitive. To build a balanced range, you need to go beyond always playing your best hands the same way. It means sometimes including hands that are not at the top of your range in spots where you would normally only show strength. For example, mixing in a few bluffs or weaker hands with your value bets will prevent others from knowing when you truly have it. When you make small bets on certain boards, you can include some hands that are not strong but still have potential. These hands might be drawing to a straight or a flush, or they might simply be too weak to call a big bet, but strong enough to pressure your opponent into folding. A balanced approach also means thinking about your range as a whole, not just focusing on the single hand you are playing. If you always bet big with only your strongest holdings, your opponents will stop paying you off. By including hands like missed flush draws in your river betting range, you create situations where your opponent cannot tell if you are betting for value or as a bluff. This mix makes your betting patterns less predictable and your overall strategy more profitable. As the hand moves past the first betting round, the pool of hands still in play tends to shift. Taking advantage of that shift by mixing in a broader set of bluffs and value hands on later streets is one way to avoid becoming predictable. By mixing in a few more combinations of bluffs and value hands on the turn and river, you make it harder for others to know where they stand. If you only show down the nuts or fold before the river, skilled players will recognize that pattern and adjust accordingly. Including hands of varying strength in your post-flop actions keeps your opponents uncertain and your strategy harder to counter. You do not need to randomize every decision. Instead, focus on varying your hand selection and your betting actions, just enough to avoid forming a clear pattern. Sometimes you will bet with a medium-strength hand, and other times you will check with a strong one. The goal is to maintain a consistent mix, so that your opponents cannot easily assign a specific hand to your action. When you keep your range balanced, you force others to make mistakes, because they are now guessing instead of reacting to a clear signal. There is a psychological side to this as well. When your play is unpredictable, it creates real pressure on your opponents. They start to question their reads. Uncertainty sets in, and they begin to hesitate. Sometimes they will fold hands that could have beaten your bluff, worried that you have the nuts. Other times they will call you down with weak holdings, thinking you are bluffing when you actually have a strong hand. This mental strain builds over time. The more confused your opponents feel, the more likely they are to make poor decisions. By keeping your range balanced, you shift the psychological advantage in your favor. The table feels different when nobody knows what you are capable of. Your bets carry more weight, and your bluffs are more believable. Opponents who cannot pin down your strategy are more likely to overfold, giving up pots that could have been theirs. They might even start calling too much, hoping to catch you bluffing, which lets your value bets get paid off more often. That sense of uncertainty is your silent ally. It is what makes poker such a rich and challenging game. When you practice balancing your range, you are not just protecting yourself from being exploited, you are shaping the flow of the game in your favor. Give yourself time to get comfortable with this. Notice how opponents respond when they can't get a clear read on you. Let that awareness settle into your process over time. Chapter 14. The Role of Intuition, Trusting Your Gut. Sometimes a read arrives before you've had time to think it through. You might sense that something feels off about an opponent's bet, or notice a familiar rhythm in the way the action unfolds. While logic and analysis give you a solid foundation, these flashes of instinct can sometimes point you toward the right decision before your conscious mind catches up. Most strong players don't ignore these feelings, but they don't let them take over either. Instead, they find a way to let intuition and analysis work together. Most of your decisions come from a structured process. You work through position, pre-flop action, and what the board suggests. But there are moments when a pattern jumps out before you've finished the math, or a detail doesn't quite fit what the numbers say. Intuition steps in here, offering a quick adjustment to your range, or a subtle warning that something does not add up. These moments can be powerful, but only if you check them against the evidence. Instead of acting on a hunch alone, take a breath and ask yourself if the feeling matches what you have seen so far. This habit keeps your decisions grounded, while still letting your instincts serve as an early warning system. The blend shows up most clearly in genuinely difficult spots. Maybe you are not sure if a strange bet means strength or weakness. Your logical process might not give you a clear answer, but you feel a strong pull in one direction. It's tempting to trust that gut reaction, especially if it's worked before. The best approach is to pause and let both voices speak. Check if your intuition lines up with the hands that make sense given the actions. If it does, you can feel more confident in your read. If not, look for where the two disagree and think about why. Over time, that checking process sharpens both sides of your thinking and makes your reads harder to second guess at the table. Intuition does not appear overnight. It is shaped by long hours at the table, watching hands play out, and seeing the same situations repeat in different forms. Each time you guess a range and see a showdown, you add another layer to your understanding. Across enough sessions, you start to recognize the small differences between value-heavy lines and bluff-weighted ones. Your mind begins to store these patterns, even if you cannot always explain them. This may be part of why experienced players seem to sense when something is off, even before the data fully supports it. As you see more hands, your subconscious builds a library of familiar scenarios. For example, you may notice that certain players call the flop widely, but only show aggression on later streets with strong hands. After enough repetitions, your instincts start to guide you through these spots faster and with greater confidence. When an opponent suddenly shifts gears or uses an unusual bet size, your gut may alert you before you have time to work through all the math. These instincts aren't magic. They tend to reflect careful attention and many hours of practice. Still, even the most seasoned gut feeling needs a check. Intuition is only as good as the experience behind it. If you rely too much on instinct without cross-checking against the facts, you risk falling into old habits or letting bias creep in. The process of narrowing ranges, counting outs, and calculating expected value keeps you honest. It helps you separate a true read from a fleeting impression. Your intuition gets sharper as you test it against what the data actually shows and see which reads hold up. Some decisions at the table invite you to lean into your intuition, while others call for a more disciplined approach. Imagine a spot where an opponent calls a small bet on a dry ace-high board. Your gut might suggest they're holding missed draws. But if you recall that their pre-flop range doesn't include many draws to begin with, your intuition and the evidence don't line up. That's the moment to slow down. Or maybe you face a large river bet, and your instincts tell you it's either the strongest possible hand or a complete bluff. If this matches how your opponent has played earlier streets, a hero call might be justified. But if your intuition clashes with the facts, it is wise to slow down and look for more evidence. There are also times when an early position raiser shows sudden weakness after the flop. You might feel that their range no longer includes premium hands, based on how tightly they usually open. Let your intuition flag this shift, but use your analysis to confirm it. When scare cards arrive on the turn, and you sense a bluff, consider whether your opponent has folded to pressure in the past. If your experience and logic both point in the same direction, you can act with more confidence. The art is knowing when to trust your gut and when to fall back on the numbers. If your instincts are well trained and match the data, they can help you make quick, accurate decisions. If you sense that your read is based on fear, wishful thinking, or a recent bad beat, it is time to slow down and lean on your analytical process. The balance between these approaches is what separates good players from the rest. The sharpest reads often feel like stillness rather than effort. You notice something, you check it quietly against what you've seen, and you move forward. That's the rhythm you're building toward. It doesn't announce itself. It just gets steadier with time. Chapter 15. The Value of Experience. learning from every hand. Every hand you play carries information you did not have before it started. It is a living lesson. In No Limit Texas Hold'em, every round you play gives you new information about your opponents. Each time someone checks or calls, you're gathering evidence. You're not guessing a single hand. You're watching the full picture, narrow as the betting unfolds. It's not just the dramatic moments that matter. Even the most routine hands teach you something, if you're willing to look. Maybe an opponent calls on the flop in a way that doesn't fit with the strongest pairs or sets. Maybe they check in a spot where most players would raise with a big hand. Each of these small details helps you refine your sense of what hands are likely. This process of observation is never finished. There are roughly 17,296 possible flop combinations when you account for the 2 cards already in your hand. So each board brings a new puzzle and a new chance to learn. The real growth comes after the hand is over. When you review your session, you can reflect on the decisions you made and the reads you formed. Did an opponent's pre-flop call reveal a tendency to play weaker hands from early position? Did you miss a clue in their timing or sizing? When you look back, you'll start to see patterns that were invisible in the moment. This habit of reviewing hands, even the ones that felt routine, sharpens your judgment and helps you catch patterns you missed in the moment. Over time, all these lessons build on each other. As you play more hands, you start to notice recurring themes in how people act with certain types of holdings. Maybe you observe that a particular opponent rarely slow plays with big pairs, so a check from them tends to signal weakness. Or you notice that another player tends to flat call the flop with draws but raises with made hands. By paying attention and reflecting on these patterns, you begin to develop a more accurate sense of what opponents are likely to hold. This process is not instant. It takes many hands and many sessions to build a mental library of these patterns. With each new session, you add to your experience and slowly refine the reads you bring to the table. You might recall that the chance of being dealt any pocket pair before the flop is roughly 6%. Over time, you will see how often certain hands show up and how players tend to act with them. When you reflect on past hands, you might remember situations where an opponent's flat call on the flop made it unlikely they had a strong pair or a set. This kind of reflection helps you make faster and more accurate judgments in future hands. As your experience grows, your instincts become sharper. You start to notice when a turn call fits a pattern you have seen before. With enough repetition, you begin to anticipate what hands are possible, even before the final cards are revealed. You're building a quiet, steady database of outcomes and tendencies, letting each hand inform the next. This is how seasoned players move from rough guesses to more precise reads. The process is gradual, but it rewards patience and care at every stage. Less experienced players often run into the same traps. They might assign an opponent too wide a range after a simple check or call, missing the chance to eliminate strong hands that no longer make sense. Sometimes new players forget to factor in position or rely too much on 1 or 2 observations rather than looking for the broader pattern. For example, failing to notice that a pre-flop check often rules out big pairs leads to confusion later in the hand. Another common pitfall is misunderstanding the odds of certain outcomes. The chance of flopping a set with a pocket pair is around 12%, a reminder that not every passive call means a monster hand. Or, when holding a flush draw with 9 outs, the chance to hit on the next card is about 19%. Less experienced players may overlook these numbers and make assumptions that do not match the reality of the game. Seasoned players use their time at the table to sidestep these mistakes. They recall similar situations from past hands and use those memories to read weak actions as likely bluffs or marginal holdings. They know how to adjust their reads when new information appears, letting go of old assumptions and focusing on what the current hand is telling them. They also make a habit of reviewing mistakes and successes, using those lessons to adapt their strategies for next time. The ability to learn from every hand, to treat each round as a small lesson, is what separates steady improvement from stagnation. If you let yourself be open to these lessons, you will find that your reads grow sharper and your confidence grows steadier. The table becomes a place of quiet discovery. Each hand adds to your understanding. Take your time. Let every hand settle into your memory. Trust that experience will shape your game, one decision at a time. Chapter 16. Adjusting to Online Play. Digital Dynamics. The chips and cards look the same. The felt might be digital, but the betting rounds are identical. What has changed is everything around them. There is no eye contact, no shuffling feet, no nervous smile across the table. The physical world has stepped back, and in its place are new kinds of signals. There is no eye contact, no shuffling feet, no nervous smiles or confident posture. The physical world has faded, replaced by a digital one. Here, the clues you need come in new forms. Instead of watching for a twitch or a sigh, you listen for patterns in timing and betting. Every hand unfolds across 4 betting rounds. That part has not changed. But online, the speed of each action tells its own quiet story. Sometimes a player snap calls in an instant, barely pausing between bets. Other times, there is a long silence before a check or a sudden oversized raise. These timing tells replace the subtle gestures you once watched for at a live table. A quick call can suggest a simple decision, often a mediocre hand with no clear plan for the rest of the street. A long pause followed by a big bet can lean either way. It might reflect someone carefully constructing a bluff, or it might be a player taking their time before betting a hand they are confident in. The meaning is never certain, but the patterns start to reveal themselves when you pay attention over many hands. Bet sizing also changes its tone online. You will see players who always bet small, clicking the same button every time, and others who wait before firing out a large wager. Over time, these choices form a rhythm. A player who only makes big bets after a long delay might be showing strength. Someone who bets small without hesitation could be protecting a weak holding or just moving the action along. The key is not to jump to conclusions based on a single instance. Instead, you want to watch how these digital tells repeat. When you see the same player act quickly on every marginal hand and slow down only when the pot grows, you start to narrow their range with more confidence. Online, the absence of physical presence means you need to build profiles from these digital signals. It is less about a single moment, and more about the patterns that emerge over dozens or even hundreds of hands. You begin to notice who acts quickly with strong hands, and who hesitates before bluffing. These habits turn into clues you can use when making tough decisions. Still be careful. Timing tells are not perfect. Sometimes a slow play is just a lagging connection, or a player distracted by something else. Let these signals shape your thinking, but always remember they are just one part of the bigger picture. To help make sense of this digital world, many players turn to software tools. Heads-up displays are among the most common. By now you know what VPIP and PFR tell you. What matters online is how those numbers shift as your sample grows and how they interact with the timing patterns you are already tracking. With enough hands, these stats start to tell a story. A player with a high VPIP and a low PFR is likely calling too often and not raising enough. Someone with both numbers high could be playing an aggressive loose style. Tracking software goes beyond real-time stats. Programs like Poker Ranger go further. They let you map how a calling range holds up across different board textures and show you which hands a frequent 3-better is likely bluffing with versus which ones they are betting for value. The result is a clearer picture of where their range is strong and where it is thin as each street plays out. The more data you gather, the clearer these patterns become. Still, you need a large enough sample for the numbers to mean something. Drawing conclusions too quickly from a handful of hands can be misleading. A player might look tight over 10 hands, only to reveal a much wider range once you have seen 100. Use the software to spot trends, but do not let it override your sense of the game as it unfolds. Sometimes the best decision comes from blending the numbers with what you have learned about the flow of the table. It's easy to get caught up in the data and lose track of what's actually happening at the table. Software is a tool, not a replacement for your own judgment. The numbers can point you in the right direction, but the real game happens in the choices each player makes, one hand at a time. Stay alert to sudden changes in behavior. Notice when an opponent switches gears or abandons their usual patterns. Let the software support your hand range analysis, not control it. Another layer of complexity comes with player anonymity. Online, most players use screen names instead of real names. There is no face to remember, no reputation that carries over from one game to the next. This freedom can change the way people play. Without the social pressure of a live setting, many players tend to loosen up. You will tend to see wider pre-flop ranges online, with players willing to enter pots with hands they might fold in a live setting. The absence of direct accountability can lead to bolder, more aggressive moves. Some players add weaker hands to their range, hoping to catch a favorable board or simply test the limits of what is possible. At the same time, anonymity creates new opportunities for you to adjust. Many players online tend to defend their blinds less frequently than the situation warrants, sometimes folding hands that would be reasonable calls in a live setting. This means you can rule out certain holdings when building their range, making your decisions more precise. But you also need to be cautious. Unknown opponents can surprise you with unexpected lines or sudden aggression. When you cannot rely on physical cues, you must lean more on the digital patterns you have observed and the statistical profiles you have built. Facing anonymous players, it helps to start cautiously. Let the first few hands reveal something about their style. Watch how they bet, how quickly they act, and how often they enter the pot. Use these clues to sort players into general types. They might lean tight, loose, aggressive, or passive. Stay ready to update those assumptions as new information appears. The online environment rewards those who can adapt quickly, building and revising hand ranges as the session unfolds. Standard online tables seat either 6 or 9 players. Both formats are widely available, and the most common format varies depending on the site and stake level. This means you will encounter a mix of playing styles and stack depths, often shifting from one game to another. The pace is faster than live poker, and the digital environment means you will see more hands per hour. This extra volume gives you more chances to gather data and refine your reads, but it also asks you to keep your focus sharp. Over time, the digital world of online poker will feel less foreign. The absence of physical tells becomes an invitation to pay closer attention to new kinds of patterns. Betting rhythms, timing decisions, and statistical trends all become part of your toolkit. The challenge is to let these digital dynamics strengthen your range-based thinking, rather than pull you away from it. Each new session brings a fresh set of puzzles, shaped by the quiet signals that only exist in the space between clicks and cards. As you settle into the next hand, the clues are still there. They just sound a little different than before. The rhythm of the game will guide you if you stay with it. Each hand adds something to your picture of this digital space. The table keeps changing, and your ability to move with it is what keeps you ahead. Chapter 17: The Power of Observation, Refining the Skill. Most players watch the game. Fewer actually see it. There is a difference between letting hands wash over you and tracking each one with a quiet, deliberate focus that builds something useful over time. It is the steady habit of watching with purpose, of letting the details of each action, each pause, and each bet settle into your mind as the hand unfolds. Strong players tend not to just react to cards or chase odds. They stay in a habit of collecting information, narrowing down what opponents might hold, and building a case for each decision they make. Each action you observe gives you a reason to adjust what hands are still likely. A raise from early position points toward a narrower set of holdings than the same raise from the button. As the hand develops, the way a player bets, checks, or sizes their risk keeps trimming that picture down. Over time, this process lets you make decisions that are grounded in probability, not just hope or fear. When you understand that flopping a set with a pocket pair happens roughly 1 time in about 8, it starts to shape how you think about which situations come up often and which ones are genuinely rare. These small details, gathered through steady observation, become the roots of all your strategic thinking. You will find that observation is not a passive act. It is not about letting the game move past you. It calls for active, deliberate focus, even during hands you have already folded. When you practice this kind of attention, you notice patterns that most players miss. You see which opponents fold to pressure, who prefers to call, and who is likely to bluff when the big pots build. This steady habit of seeing and remembering forms the base layer of every accurate hand range you build. It is the quiet work that makes all the other skills possible. To sharpen your observation, you will want to know what to watch for. Most of the clues you will gather fall into a few main categories. First, there are betting patterns. The way a player sizes their bets, sometimes smaller, sometimes large, can hint at how strong or weak they feel about their hand. For example, a half-pot bet on the river can sometimes lean toward a value hand, but the range of what it represents is still wide and depends heavily on the player making it. This is not always the case, but bet sizing can act as a clue when you combine it with other information. Timing is another layer worth watching. A long pause on an ace-high board from a player who plays a wide range can suggest they are wrestling with the decision. Quick calls and instant checks carry their own signals too. The catch is that the meaning shifts depending on how that player normally moves, so you need a baseline before timing becomes useful. Physical gestures and action sequences offer another layer of information, especially in live games. The way a player shuffles their chips, how they look at the board, or how they reach for their cards can all narrow down their possible holdings. A player who hesitates before betting may be weighing the risk, while someone who acts with steady confidence may be holding a stronger hand. These signals are never perfect on their own, but when you link them with betting and timing, you can often eliminate hands that do not fit the story. It is important to remember that no single clue tells the full truth. One player's small river bet might mean strength, while another's could be a nervous attempt at a cheap bluff. Patterns only become meaningful when you watch them over time and consider them alongside position, table dynamics, and each player's tendencies. The real skill comes from weighing these clues together, never letting one detail overwhelm your judgment. This is what makes observation such a subtle and powerful tool. If you want to refine your observation, you will need to practice with intention. Start by giving yourself a baseline for what hands players are likely to have from each position and action. Study standard ranges using charts and tools, and then watch how real games play out compared to these models. When you see something that does not fit, pause and ask yourself what new information you have learned about that player's tendencies. Staying focused is not always easy. A noisy table or a tense pot can pull your attention away from the details that matter most. Try to keep your mind anchored on position, stack sizes, and the tendencies of each player. When you practice this consistently, you start to notice deviations more naturally. If your attention drifts, bring it back to the action and to the patterns already forming. You can also learn by watching players who excel at this skill. The most observant players are not just paying attention to the obvious bets and raises. They are quietly eliminating hands from their opponent's ranges as each street passes. They take nothing for granted, always updating their assumptions with fresh evidence. By studying their approach, you can see how observation is a living process, never fixed, always adapting, and always looking for ways to refine the picture. Over time, you will notice that observation is not a separate skill. It is woven into every decision you make, every range you build, and every adjustment you choose. Let yourself move slowly through each hand, letting the details settle in. As you do this, you will find that your reads grow sharper, your decisions grow steadier, and your understanding of the game deepens. Let the quiet art of observation become a steady companion at the table, guiding you with each new hand, each new clue, and each new possibility. Chapter 18. Analyzing Showdowns. Learning from revealed hands. For a brief moment, the uncertainty lifts. Two players turn their hands face up, and everything you were estimating becomes something you can actually see. You see exactly what your opponent chose to play, how they arrived at the river, and what cards they actually held. This is not just the end of a single hand. It is a window into how your opponent thinks about the game. Most of the time, poker is a game of uncertainty. You build hand ranges from fragments. A bet here, a fold there, a line that fits one player type better than another. But when a hand reaches showdown, you get concrete evidence. You see the real hand behind all those earlier actions. That is why showdowns matter so much. Each one lets you check if your assumptions were on track, or if you missed something in your range-building process. This is especially valuable in live games, where information is scarce. In tournament settings, you may see more hands revealed at showdown. As blinds increase and stacks shrink, players tend to have less room to maneuver before committing, which can lead to more all-in situations and more cards being turned over. Each revealed hand is a clue. Over time, these moments add up. You start to notice patterns, which hands certain players take to showdown, which ones disappear before the river, and how their strategy shifts as the stakes change. It is important to pay attention to the context of each showdown. Was the player in early position or late? Was the pot large or small? Did they bet aggressively or just call down? These details help you understand not just what they played, but why they played it that way. Every time a hand is turned over, treat it as a learning opportunity. Ask yourself what that hand says about their overall approach. Are they sticking to strong hands, or are they willing to gamble with weaker holdings? Are they chasing draws or folding before they get there? You can use these glimpses to start mapping out your opponent's strategies. The more hands you see at showdown, the clearer the picture becomes. The more showdowns you observe, the easier it becomes to confirm or challenge the profiles you have already started building. A player who seemed tight from their pre-flop tendencies may show up with a surprising bluff. Someone who looked passive might reveal a range wider than their betting suggested. Each showdown either reinforces what you thought or gives you a reason to revise it. To make the most of these opportunities, it helps to develop a systematic approach to analyzing revealed hands. Start by recalling the actions your opponent took through the hand. What did their early bets suggest about their range? Did their later decisions fit with what you would expect from that type of hand? When the cards are finally shown, compare their actual holding to the range you assigned earlier. This comparison is the heart of the process. Look for patterns in how opponents play different categories of hands. When a player turns over a strong made hand at showdown, it can suggest a tendency toward tighter play. They may be letting go of weaker holdings before the river, reaching showdown, mainly when their hand gives them a reason to stay in. On the other hand, if someone regularly shows up with weak pairs, missed draws, or marginal hands, you are probably facing a looser, more aggressive style. These players are willing to bluff, chase, or call down with less. Try to notice not just the strength of the hand, but the way it was played. Did the player slow down on scary boards, or keep betting with second pair? Did they raise with draws, or only with made hands? Each of these actions helps you refine your expectations about their range in similar situations. When you see a bluff reach showdown, think back through the earlier betting and ask whether any of it hinted at what was coming. If a value hand was played passively the whole way, consider what that pattern might look like the next time it appears. Sometimes, a player will surprise you by showing a hand outside the range you expected. Maybe they called down with something much weaker than you thought possible, or they bluffed in a spot that seemed unlikely. These moments are valuable. They tell you where your assumptions need adjusting. If you notice someone consistently showing certain types of hands, you can start to add those to their expected range. If you never see a player reveal bluffs, you might want to tighten your calling ranges against them. As you gather more of these observations, you can start refining your strategies for future hands. When you notice that a particular opponent only calls down with strong hands, you can adjust by bluffing less and value betting more when you have it. If you see someone willing to make loose calls or chase draws, you can widen your value range and be more selective about when you try to bluff them. The key is to let the evidence from showdowns guide your adjustments, not just your hunches. It helps to keep a mental or written note of these patterns as you play. Over time, tracking which players tend to show down certain hands or act in specific ways builds a strong foundation for your ongoing strategy. Each new piece of information makes your future range assessments more precise. When you see a familiar betting sequence or timing tell, you can connect it to what you have already learned from previous showdowns. The real advantage comes when you start to integrate these insights with everything else you know about the table. Showdown data does not exist in isolation. It works alongside your understanding of table dynamics, your image at the table, and the way the game is flowing. You might notice that a player's willingness to call down shifts when their stack gets short. Their bet sizing may also change once they've built up chips. All these details help you construct a more complete picture. Pattern recognition is what ties it all together. The more you notice recurring behaviors, the easier it becomes to anticipate how your opponents will act. The same bet sizes keep appearing. The same hesitation surfaces before certain decisions. The same kinds of hands show up at showdown. These patterns start to feel familiar. When you combine this with your growing knowledge of hand ranges and strategy, you start to approach familiar situations with a steadier sense of direction. The guesswork doesn't disappear, but it becomes more informed. You are using real evidence to shape your decisions, one showdown at a time. There's no rush to process everything at once. A single revealed hand won't transform your reads overnight, but it adds something. Another data point, another correction to a profile you were building on limited information. The picture gets clearer gradually, hand by hand, session by session. That's how the skill actually grows. Chapter 19: The Human Factor, Psychological Insights. Emotional states shape the way people approach every decision at the poker table. When a player feels confident, you might see them open up their hand range, reaching for more speculative hands in late position. That sense of control can show up as looser pre-flop calls or extra raises, sometimes even chasing suited connectors that would normally hit the muck. Confidence is not always steady, and it can shift quickly, especially after a big win or a successful bluff. Anxiety works in the opposite direction. When nerves creep in, players often tighten up. They start folding hands they might have played just a few hands earlier, especially when the pressure rises pre-flop. Marginal hands do not see the flop as often. Every decision becomes slower, more careful, and the range of hands shrinks. Sometimes you can spot this change in the way a player hesitates, or how they seem less willing to get involved in big pots. Frustration can send a player down a different path. Some chase losses by widening their range and forcing the action, hoping to get even. You might notice more aggression, more bets with weaker holdings, or a sudden willingness to call down with hands that would usually be folded. Other players react to frustration by clamping down, tightening their range even more, refusing to risk any more chips unless they have a premium hand. These shifts are not always obvious, but if you watch closely, you will see how a player's demeanor and betting choices start to drift away from their usual patterns. It helps to pay attention to these emotional signals, because they often go hand in hand with changes in hand range. When you notice a player who was once cautious, suddenly pushing chips around, or a loose player going quiet and folding more, you can start to adjust your range estimates. Emotional context doesn't stay fixed. The same player can swing from bold to timid over the course of a session, and each swing brings new opportunities to refine your reads. Physical and verbal cues, often called tells, offer another window into a player's mindset. Some tells are subtle, like a hand that trembles when reaching for chips. This kind of physical cue can signal anxiety, which often means the player is sitting on a weaker range. Other tells come through in conversation. A player who suddenly becomes chatty after a big bet may be feeling confident. That shift in energy can suggest their range leans toward value hands, though it's worth weighing that against their betting line before drawing conclusions. Tells are most useful when you know a player's baseline behavior. If someone is always talkative, a little more chatter may not mean much. If a quiet player suddenly starts joking after moving all in, that shift might be meaningful. The key is to watch for changes, not just isolated actions. Over time, you will start to see patterns. Maybe a certain player always leans back when bluffing, or another tenses up when holding a monster. These patterns, once noticed, help you refine your range assignments beyond the basic math. Online, the clues are different, but the principle is the same. You might see hesitation or snap actions in better timing, or notice how certain players tighten up after losing a big pot. Heads-up display statistics can surface players who tend to fold more often to aggression. When you pair those numbers with any available tells, you can start to build a more useful profile, even if that picture is never fully complete. Consistent tells, especially when paired with betting patterns, can reveal how a player's psychological state is shifting and how their hand range is changing with it. External pressure shapes these psychological states in powerful ways. In higher stakes cash games, the size of the pot or the stack on the line can push even experienced players toward more cautious decisions. You will see some players fold hands they would normally play, narrowing their pre-flop range to avoid costly mistakes. Tournament conditions add another layer. As the bubble approaches, pressure tends to mount, and stacks feel more precious. Many players pull back from speculative hands, preferring to wait for a cleaner spot. That kind of stress can nudge ranges toward tighter, more value-heavy holdings, though the effect varies depending on stack depth and individual temperament. Pressure does not affect everyone the same way. Some players, faced with a short stack in a tournament, shift gears and start shoving with a wider range, hoping to double up before the blinds eat away their chips. Others become even more conservative, folding hands that might have been easy calls earlier. Large pots and deep runs can make decisions feel weighty, and that often leads to conservative play. Speculative hands get folded, and only the strongest hands remain in play. Skilled players learn to adjust their own ranges and watch for these shifts in others. They sense when an opponent is feeling the squeeze and likely to fold to aggression, or when someone is tilting and ready to gamble. They use stack sizes, table position, and tournament stage as clues, blending them with observed tells and betting patterns to build a more accurate range estimate. The players who manage pressure well aren't ignoring emotion. They're reading it. Every shift in mood, every moment of hesitation or sudden boldness carries information. Sit with that awareness long enough, and it starts to feel less like observation and more like intuition. That's what separates a player who knows the math from one who understands the person holding the cards. Chapter 20: Advanced Concepts. Game Theory Optimal Play. Most strategy is built around one opponent. You study their tendencies, adjust your reads, and try to stay a step ahead of their decisions. But there's a layer beneath all of that. It's not about who's sitting across from you. It's about building a strategy that holds up regardless. The core idea is straightforward. You build a strategy that is balanced enough that no opponent can consistently profit by taking advantage of it. When your decisions reach that point, you've arrived at what's called equilibrium. Equilibrium means that if your opponent shifts their strategy to try to counter yours, they don't gain anything by doing so. Neither player can do better by moving away from their current approach. That's the state game theory optimal play is trying to reach. Every imbalance in your strategy is an opening. A sharp opponent who finds one can profit from it repeatedly until you adjust. Maybe you're folding too often to certain bets, or betting in patterns that reveal your hand strength. Those gaps are what opponents look for. A game theory optimal strategy closes those gaps by making your actions unpredictable in a precise mathematical sense. Your range contains value hands and bluffs at frequencies that prevent anyone from knowing exactly how to respond. Maintaining that balance starts before the flop. One of the things game theory optimal thinking teaches is that your pre-flop raising range benefits from using a consistent sizing across different hand types. If you tend to raise larger with strong hands and smaller with weaker ones, you're giving opponents a way to narrow your range. Keeping your sizing consistent means an opponent can't immediately narrow your holdings based on how much you put in. As the hand develops, equilibrium shapes how you construct your range on each street. It's not enough to have good hands in your betting range. You also need hands that block the strongest parts of your opponent's likely range. Bluffing with hands that reduce the probability your opponent holds certain strong combinations is part of what makes a range harder to play against. The choice of which hands to bluff with isn't random. It's guided by how well those hands interact with what your opponent is likely to hold. By the time you reach the river, the relationship between bluffs and value hands in your betting range becomes especially important. The appropriate ratio of bluffs to value bets is connected directly to the size of your bet. A larger bet offers your opponent better pot odds to call. A balanced range accounts for that. When your bluff-to-value ratio is calibrated to the pot odds you're offering, calling and folding tend to produce similar outcomes for your opponent. That's equilibrium in action. Game theory optimal thinking also shapes how you read your opponent. When someone 3-bets before the flop, their range includes both strong value hands and bluffs, and position influences how much of each is present. Position and situation influence how much of each is present. That awareness helps you avoid overreacting to aggression or underestimating how wide a player's range might actually be. One of the more advanced applications involves recognizing when your range holds a significant advantage on a particular board texture. When the flop connects more naturally with your range than your opponent's, you may have what's called a nut advantage. That advantage influences how frequently you should be betting and at what sizes. A range that holds more of the strongest possible hands on a given board can support more aggressive betting, including overbets that wouldn't be appropriate for a weaker range. Applying these ideas during live play requires practice. You won't always have time to calculate exact frequencies at the table. What develops over time is a feel for when your range is balanced and when it isn't. That feel comes from studying the concepts away from the table, running through scenarios, and noticing patterns across many hands. It also comes from staying attentive to how board textures shift the dynamics between your range and your opponent's. Game theory optimal play isn't a fixed destination. It's a way of thinking that sharpens with use. Each session adds to your understanding of where your strategy is balanced and where it could be more precise. The more clearly you see your own ranges, the more accurately you can read the ranges of others. That accuracy is what makes the framework valuable over time. An opponent who cannot find reliable patterns in your play has no consistent way to adjust against you. That's a quiet kind of strength. It doesn't announce itself in any single hand. It simply makes it harder for opponents to find an edge against you. Chapter 21: Adapting to Changing Trends, the Evolving Game. The game you're playing today is not the same game it was a few years ago. That's not a warning. It's just the nature of how poker works. Players observe patterns, find counters, share ideas, and the whole landscape gradually shifts beneath you. Hand ranges are a good place to see this happen. What counts as a reasonable opening range from a given position drifts as the player pool adjusts. When enough opponents recognize that tight early position raises tend to fold to pressure, they begin applying that pressure more often. The players being pressured then have to respond by widening their range to defend more effectively, or by 3-betting hands they used to fold. That cycle of adjustment and counter-adjustment is what shapes the meta over time. The important thing to understand is that this process never stops. There's no point where everyone settles into one final strategy and the game freezes. When a tactic becomes widely understood, it loses some of its edge. Players find ways around it, and then those new responses become the thing others have to solve. Keeping up with that cycle means staying alert to when something that used to work is starting to work less. One useful way to stay grounded in what's actually happening is to track what you see rather than what you assume. Player tendencies leave traces. How often someone 3-bets. How often they call pre-flop versus fold. How their betting frequency shifts between the flop and the river. These tendencies can be measured, and measuring them is what keeps your range assessments honest. A player who rarely 3-bets is telling you something. You can widen your opening range against them, because the cost of being pushed off your hand is lower. That's not a guess. It's a data-driven adjustment based on observable tendencies. One metric that captures this kind of information is aggression factor. It's calculated by dividing a player's aggressive actions, meaning bets and raises, by their passive actions, meaning calls. A high aggression factor signals someone who pushes back often. A low one signals someone who prefers to call and see what happens. Knowing which type you're up against helps you estimate not just what hands they might have, but how they're likely to build the pot on future streets. That kind of adjustment is exploitative play in practice. You're shifting away from balance toward what maximizes your edge against that specific player's tendencies. The trade-off is that exploitative adjustments only hold up as long as the opponent stays predictable. When they adapt, you have to adapt again. That back and forth is exactly why flexibility matters more than memorizing any particular system. Staying flexible starts with treating your range assumptions as working estimates rather than settled conclusions. On each street, you're using process of elimination, removing hands that no longer fit what an opponent has done. That process works best when you're not attached to your first read. Staying informed is part of this too. Discussing hands with other players who are thinking carefully about the game creates a useful kind of pressure. It exposes blind spots. A range you've been assigning confidently might look different when someone else walks through why a hand doesn't fit there. That kind of outside perspective is something solo review can't fully replicate. One concrete shift worth tracking is how bluff-to-value ratios change across streets. You already know that bluffs tend to dominate earlier streets, while value hands represent a larger share of most players' ranges by the river. The adjustment here is applying that knowledge dynamically. If your range estimates aren't shifting as the hand develops, they're going to fall behind. The broader point is that a strategy locked in place eventually becomes something opponents can plan around. What keeps you competitive isn't having the most sophisticated system. It's having a system you're willing to question. When the evidence suggests that something has shifted, being willing to revise is the skill. The game keeps moving. Letting your thinking move with it is what gives you the best chance of staying ahead. Chapter 22: The Mental Game. Maintaining focus and discipline. You already know how to assign ranges. You know how position shapes what hands are likely. You know how betting patterns narrow the possibilities street by street. The question now is whether you can actually access all of that during a hand, when the pressure is on and the clock is moving. That gap is where most of the real work happens. When your focus slips, the first thing to go is your read on how an opponent's range has shifted. You might remember their pre-flop open, but forget to factor in the check they made on the flop. You might stop tracking how their turn bet interacts with their earlier passivity. Those are attention failures, not knowledge gaps. Staying present in each hand means following the full sequence of actions, not just the most recent one. An early position open already tells you something. What they do on a coordinated board tells you more. Letting your mind drift between those two moments means you're working with incomplete information, even when the full picture was available to you. Distraction also makes it harder to balance your own range. When you're not fully concentrating, you start defaulting to obvious lines. Your bets become easier to categorize. Opponents who are paying attention will notice that your check raises only show up with strong hands, or that your small bets always signal marginal holdings. That kind of drift happens gradually, and it often starts with a wandering mind. Discipline is what keeps the process running, even when the session gets uncomfortable. After a bad beat or a cooler, the temptation is to abandon the methodical approach and start reacting from emotion. You might start assuming an opponent only has premium hands because you're frustrated, which means you're ignoring the bluffs they'd reasonably include. Or you might widen their range recklessly, just to justify a call you want to make. Neither response reflects what their actions actually suggest. That emotional disruption bends your reads toward what you want to be true, rather than what the evidence supports. Recognizing the early signs of that emotional shift gives you a chance to reset before it costs you. Setting clear goals before a session helps anchor your discipline. That might mean deciding in advance how you'll respond to 3-betting frequencies, or committing to a process for narrowing ranges after a check raise rather than guessing. When you've already thought through the framework, you're less likely to abandon it under pressure. It also helps to develop a short routine for regaining composure mid-session, something simple that interrupts the emotional momentum and brings your attention back to the hand in front of you. Regular practice away from the table builds the kind of resilience that holds up when things get difficult. Visualizing common spots trains your mind to move through the narrowing process quickly and accurately. Thinking through how a wide button range interacts with different flop textures before you sit down means the logic is already familiar when it comes up. Repeated exposure to these sequences means you don't have to reconstruct the logic from scratch during a hand. It's already accessible. The narrowing process becomes automatic rather than effortful. A mental performance review works the same way as any other session review. You're asking where your attention broke down, and whether a misread came from a knowledge gap, or from a moment when you stopped tracking the action carefully. That kind of honest look builds a clearer picture of your own patterns. The players who tend to sustain accurate reads over long sessions aren't always the ones who know the most. They're the ones who've trained themselves to stay connected to the information that's already there, hand after hand, even when the session gets long and the variance gets heavy. That consistency is built slowly, through deliberate repetition and honest self-reflection. That consistency builds on its own, one session at a time. Chapter 23. The Path Forward. Continual Improvement. Somewhere along the way, the skills you've been building start to feel less like steps and more like a single ongoing current. That current doesn't stop between sessions. It keeps moving, and the question becomes whether you're moving with it. Consistent practice is what keeps that current strong. In No Limit Texas Hold'em, the process of narrowing an opponent's range based on their actions has to be repeated across many hands before it becomes truly automatic. Position and player tendencies influence ranges in ways that only reveal themselves gradually, through repeated exposure to a wide variety of situations. The more hands you play with focused attention on this process, the more natural it becomes to eliminate unlikely holdings as a hand progresses. Even experienced players find that taking time away from active practice can dull the sharpness of these reads. Treating practice as a long-term habit, rather than a destination, keeps that sharpness intact. Repetition alone isn't enough, though. What you do after a session matters just as much as what happens during it. Reviewing past hands lets you identify patterns in how accurately you assigned ranges based on pre-flop and post-flop actions. You might notice that you consistently read opponents well when they show tight defending tendencies on certain flop types. That pattern is worth recognizing. You might also discover that you've been overestimating bluff frequencies in an opponent's range without fully accounting for their positional tendencies. That kind of error is harder to see in the moment. It tends to show up only when you step back and look at multiple hands together. Written notes or session logs can make this process more reliable. When you track your reads and outcomes over time, patterns become harder to ignore. Honest self-assessment leads to targeted improvement. Without it, you're left with vague discomfort and no clear direction. It's the difference between knowing something felt off and understanding specifically where your range assignment drifted from the evidence. That specificity is what allows you to make adjustments that actually hold up in future sessions. The game itself doesn't stand still either. Poker theory continues to evolve, and range thinking evolves with it. New insights into range construction and balancing emerge regularly, and staying current with them supports adaptability in ways that past experience alone can't provide. Bluff to value thinking on different streets continues to be refined as the player pool develops new approaches. Equity distribution has become increasingly central to how serious players approach post-flop decisions, and that shift is worth staying current with. Engaging regularly with educational resources and discussions keeps these ideas accessible and applicable, rather than abstract. Adaptability is the quality that ties all of this together. A player who practices consistently, reflects honestly, and stays current with evolving theory is building something that compounds over time. No single session produces mastery. What produces mastery is the accumulation of focused effort, honest review, and a willingness to revise when new information suggests a better approach. The commitment to that process is itself a form of skill. There's no final version of this game to arrive at. Some of the most accurate reads you'll ever make are likely still ahead of you. Let that be a source of quiet momentum rather than pressure. The path forward is simply the one you keep walking.